Hi, this is Clint Lanier, Professor of Professional Communication. Today we're going to talk about analyzing your audience. This is a step that you have to take before you can start writing anything or creating any type of communication. You need to know who you're talking to, and you need to do a little bit of analysis about those people, okay? And so that's what we're going to practice today, how to analyze these people, things that you need to think about, and so forth. I'm going to give you a brief example, and then we'll talk about the number of audiences and readers that you might have to worry about. I'm going to discuss the different roles that readers might play. I'll talk about their characteristics and things that you need to think about. And then finally, we'll talk about context and relationships that those readers might have with you and with the document. So let's start with a brief example, okay? I have a friend who's really a smart guy, a brilliant engineer. He was able to get his electrical engineering degree in about 4.5 years, which is pretty fast for most engineers today. They take about 5 years in college. He then went on to get his PhD, skipped his master's degree, went right to the PhD program, and excelled in that PhD program. Graduated with a job lined up at a government lab. His specialty was in telecommunications, wireless telecommunications. When he graduated, he had a couple of patents, and he helped author a couple of textbooks. So basically a really, really smart guy. And as an engineer, he probably had no equal or no peer in what he did. And that's why the government hired him to do the research for them. So he gets put on this project, and immediately the project is behind schedule. And he's not at the facility that long. So it's certainly not his fault. It was behind schedule, and they placed him there. The project costs have also soared for this project. They've gone way above what they had expected this project to cost them. And they needed to renew the contract in order to continue working on this particular project. So to facilitate this, an admiral in the U.S. Navy who was funding this project was going to be visiting the lab that my friend worked at, and they had asked my friend to do a presentation for the admiral so that they can understand a little bit more about the project and hopefully get it funded. And so my friend was pretty confident. After all, he's a brilliant engineer and he knows a lot about what he's doing. And he decided to give a presentation to this admiral. The problem is, about 20 minutes into the presentation, the admiral got up and walked out without him finishing the presentation. So he told me about it. I asked him a little bit more about the circumstances behind this and about what happened, and this is what he told me, that he felt the best way to approach the project or the problem of getting this contract renewed was to tell the admiral exactly what was going on with their project. So to provide him the technical details of why the project is causing problems, why it's behind schedule, and why there are more costs. And so he lined up about 30 different slides with the mathematical formulas that would walk the admiral through the problem. And he was horrified when the admiral got up and walked out. And I said, well, let's think about this. What happened? Why did the admiral get up and walk out? And he couldn't figure it out himself. So we started going through the details. So let's go through it together and see if we can figure out why the admiral got up and walked out. Well, first of all, think about what is it that the admiral does. Okay, the admiral is an administrator, essentially. If there is a civilian version of what this admiral does, it's probably an executive level at a major corporation, right? So maybe a chief financial officer or a chief operating officer. That's the type of job this admiral has. In other words, he is not in the offices, he's not in the labs, he's not doing the type of work that my friend is doing. He's more of an administrator. How much time do these types of people have? If you've ever worked for a large corporation where you've seen the executives, they don't have a lot of time. I worked for IBM for a while, and I remember at a particular kickoff meeting, one of the vice presidents, or maybe it was one of the chief officers of IBM, happened to be on stage giving a presentation. Well, that executive had people that took him from place to place. He really didn't even know what his schedule was, but he didn't have a lot of time. He was there for 5 minutes, on stage. They took him out of the building, and he was off to the next kickoff meeting or something. So they don't have a lot of time to sit around and really get into things. Another thing to think about is what this admiral's expertise was. Do you think that this admiral was an engineer or a mathematician, like my friend was? And the answer is no. Again, he didn't get there probably because he was a brilliant mathematician or brilliant engineer. He got there probably because he was a brilliant administrator at this point, or a brilliant manager. So he was an administrator. He wasn't an engineer, not a mathematician. Probably didn't have a background in math or a background in engineering or anything like that. And he didn't have a lot of time on his hands. So this is what we ended up doing. I helped him create a 5-minute presentation. There were 3 total slides, and it went like this. This is what the problem is with the project. This is when the project will be completed, and this is how much money we need to complete the project. That was it. The Admiral was happy. He got up and walked out after the presentation. He funded the contract again, and my friend ended up working. He still works there today, and obviously the project's now long gone, but the project was a success thanks to my friend's efforts and getting the funding for the project. But it came down to understanding who his audience was. Who his audience was, what the information was that the audience member wanted or needed, and then going from there. Without doing that analysis, failure is what happens. Okay. In other words, you write a brilliant report, but the report never does its job. Maybe somebody wanted you to answer a question about something, and the report never answers that question. Had you only thought about who your audience was, who the readers were, you might have understood what it was they wanted, answered the question for them, and been fine, okay? So the bottom line, you must understand who your audience is and what they want before you can design your communication. Now, how do you do that? The answer is in performing an audience analysis. First, you need to understand that there are a number of audiences or readers. There's not going to be just one. So start the process by understanding exactly who you are communicating with, but also understand who else might read this document. Every professional communication will have more than one audience or reader. There is always going to be a primary audience or reader. This is the main person that's going to be reading the document at any given time. This is going to be the person that perhaps it's addressed to, perhaps that you send it to, perhaps who requested it. This will be the person that you will always keep in mind. Now, this person will have a unique set of needs and wants. They'll have a purpose, a unique purpose for reading the document. Now, your job is to, first of all, identify who is this primary audience, who is this primary reader, and then understand all that information, what they want, what their purpose might be, and so forth. It's not always easy to do. Like, for example, you might be given a task to create a report by your supervisor. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that your supervisor is going to be the primary reader of this document. Instead, your supervisor might then pass this document on to his or her supervisor. Maybe they requested it. So you must spend a lot of time trying to identify your primary audience. Also understand that there are typically more than one audience. There is typically more than one audience. These we consider a secondary audience or a secondary reader. These are people who also might read this document. And let's take the previous example for a moment. Let's say your supervisor gives you an assignment, says that they want you to create this report for them. Well, then does that mean that the supervisor is going to read that report? Well, let's just say that in that case your supervisor is the primary reader. And your supervisor reads this report and says, wow, my boss needs to know about that. And so then your supervisor then passes that document on to his or her supervisor. In that case, that person might be a secondary reader. And this is also something you have to keep in mind. Who else might read this document? And how much should that concern me? What, in other words, should I put in this document knowing that somebody else might read it? Okay. Third point to understand is that there are other audiences out there that sometimes we just can't, it's hard for us to consider. We might not even know that they exist. These are what we call phantom audiences or peripheral audiences. These are people beyond excuse me, beyond the secondary or primary audience, who might also read this document. I'll give you an example. Nurses have to write a lot of notes, a lot of charts, a lot of documentation in their job. So when they do so, think about who they're writing to. Let's take their charting, for instance. So a nurse does her charting, his or her charting on a patient and records exactly what happened to the patient and when that happened. So the types of medication they gave, the response to the medication, all the vitals, and so forth. Now, who's the reader for that chart? We could argue that the primary reader for that chart is probably going to be the doctor. So the doctor or the physician comes into the patient's room and looks at the chart and says, oh, okay, we gave this medication at this time, so that means we need to give another medication at a different time, or this was the reaction to the medication, and so on and so forth. Well, who else might read that document? A secondary audience might be the nurse that comes on the following shift. And that nurse will see what's done, oh, okay, and then keep up the charting and so forth. Think about, are there any phantom or peripheral audiences in the case of a nurse who's charting? Well, the answer is yes. For example, insurance companies. What happens if the patient has complications? An insurance company might get involved, or perhaps the patient's lawyers, or the hospital's lawyers. They could be reading those charts. And these are things that when the nurse was actually filling out the chart or creating the chart, that person would have no idea that perhaps lawyers would be reading it or insurance companies might be reading the chart. But those are phantom or peripheral audiences that nurse has to be aware of. Now, if they are aware of it, they will understand that the things that they write in there will have an impact, not just on the doctor and not just on the next nurse, but will also have an impact on perhaps an attorney who comes along if the hospital is getting sued or something. So you need to understand who these audiences are and who your primary audience is, who also might read it that you're aware of, and then generally speaking, what phantom or peripheral audiences do you need to be aware of, and what does that mean? One last thing to consider here is that in the professional workplace, every single bit of correspondence, every communication can be subpoenaed. Everything becomes a legal document at some point if it's written in a professional manner, because it speaks to what it is your organization is doing or what you have done. All right. So just understand that anything you write might someday end up in a court of law or somewhere else. Okay. So be careful what you write and understand that phantom peripheral audience. But first things first, think about who your primary audience is. Oftentimes this is easy to do. We say, oh, okay, well, I know that my supervisor is going to be the one that is reading this, but sometimes it's not so easy. And in that case, you need to do a little bit of investigation, okay? Understand that readers also have different roles that they take on. Not everyone is reading for the same thing. If you can figure out what the role of your reader is, oftentimes you can figure out what type of information they need. What is it that they want? Because depending on their role, that will help you understand what they're going to do with that information. For example, decision makers need information that helps them make a decision. So that admiral, for example, that's what he was looking for. So he was looking for information that would help him make a decision about whether or not to fund this contract. Now, what type of information, or how should that information be structured? Well, he needs to be able to compare different alternatives. Oftentimes, he needs a summary of differences between alternatives. At the very least, he often needs bottom line information. And I don't mean to say he, my apologies, but that person will need bottom line information. So think of, again, executive summaries, if you've ever written a report with an executive summary at the very beginning, or at the very least, an introduction to a report. These are often read by the decision makers. Oftentimes, so are the conclusions or the recommendations. The stuff that's in between those two, the stuff that's in between the introduction and perhaps the recommendations at the end, that's not typically read by a decision maker because, again, decision maker just needs the bottom line information in order to make some decision. So you'll have to be able to ensure that you give that to this person if this is your primary reader. Now, advisors have a different role. They help decision makers make their decision. An advisor oftentimes wants to know the details, so they're going to be reading the methods section, the results section, the discussion section, and they're going to be trying to figure out if the information is actually accurate or valid or correct. So they will be looking at things like the sources that you use. They will be looking at perhaps if you have data that you got as a result, they will therefore look at the data and ensure that the data is accurate and correct. So they will do these types of things in order to help the decision maker make a good decision. In a case like the admiral probably does have decision makers. So, and I'm sure that at that time the admiral had already asked decision makers about what he needed to know well before he got to the facility that my friend was at. So, but oftentimes what you'll see is that somebody will make a recommendation to a decision maker. The decision maker will then ask an advisor what that advisor thinks about the decision that he or she is about to make, and then go from there. Okay. There's a third role that you can think about, and these are performers or implementers. These are the people who actually do something with the information. So the very best example is a set of instructions. Okay. A decision maker probably isn't going to read a set of instructions. An advisor is probably not going to read a set of instructions. Instead, somebody who's actually doing something, implementing something, or doing something with that information is going to be reading a set of instructions. They oftentimes implement whatever decisions are made by the decision maker. Okay, so if we're talking about a report versus a set of instructions, think about the recommendations section. Think about what that section what might be done with that information. In a case like that, let's say you're recommending a course of action, a decision maker gives the report to the advisor says, yes, this is the best course of action. The decision maker then makes a decision to pursue that course of action, and then it's given to a performer or implementer to actually implement the course of action that's being recommended. Okay? So in other words, it goes through all three roles, and they all have a very different set of needs and purposes and wants. All right. So think about how that information would be structured. If you know that the person you're giving it to is a decision maker, they're going to make a decision about something. Well, again, they need alternatives, they need bottom line information, versus an advisor who wants to know how you arrived at your bottom line information, versus an implementer who needs to know how to actually perform or carry out what it is that's being recommended. Okay. So again, identify, starting from the beginning, identify who your audience is, identify what type of role they have, and next, start thinking about their very specific characteristics. These are things that will help you better understand the reader or the audience. These are things that might affect how you write something or what it is you write. So for example, one characteristic could be the reader's age. Where are they? Are they a millennial, for example? Are they a baby boomer? Are they a Gen X? All three of those different generations have very different understandings about things from, say, pop culture. So you wouldn't want to refer to a band or a music group that's very familiar to millennials because they probably would not be very familiar to baby boomers. And that's just a very simple example. But there's a number of these things. They'll also have different expectations because of their age. They will have different experiences, and they'll be coming at it from a different point of view. So think about their age and what that means to the information that you're giving. Another thing to consider is the technical expertise of your reader. This was in the Admiral's case, this is a perfect example. So my friend, a brilliant engineer, knows everything about engineering and probably knows everything there is to know about mathematics as well, especially when it comes to the work that he does. But had he thought about the Admiral, he would have thought, well, the Admiral probably hasn't taken a math course since he or she was in college. So it's probably been a long time for that Admiral. And in the day-to-day life of the Admiral, he or she probably does not use calculus all the time like I do. So think about the technical expertise of your reader. What is it that they do? Okay, what is it that they do? Because if you figure that out, you'll figure out what they know, and you'll figure out how to provide the right information to them. For example, if a nurse is writing to somebody else in the medical field, so they're doing their charting, and he or she is writing, they're going to be writing to another nurse or to another or to a physician. They will understand all the terminology used in that charting. However, let's say they were writing to an administrator or to somebody outside of the hospital, perhaps the patient's families. In a case like that, they'll have to understand that the patient's family or the administrators don't have the same technical expertise. So in a case like that, they would have to define all the terms that are being used in here. They'll have to tell them what they mean when they talk about a particular procedure, or perhaps explain what a particular drug does. Things that they wouldn't have to do to when they're writing to a doctor, but things that they would have to do if they're writing to, say, the patient's family. Another thing to consider is the education. Now, this is a very how can I put it, kind of surface level one. It's not very complicated. It doesn't present a lot of risks, and it's easy for you to do. So, are they a physician, or do they have did they take a lot of math classes, or whatever it happens to be? If you know what their education is, you can oftentimes understand how you need to write to this person. Okay. One thing is, don't be fooled by a lack of college education. So, say this person doesn't have any college education. That doesn't mean that they are simple, or that they are that you cannot create a complicated or complex message to this person. All right. So don't think that lack of college education equates to perhaps simple or stupid. That's certainly not true. There are a slew of people without college educations who are absolutely brilliant and smart and can follow very complicated arguments. What it does mean, though, is, again, if you know that they're a math major, you can probably use a lot of math when you write to mathematical formulas when you are designing a communication. However, if they are not a math major, then they might not use mathematics every day, and you might not want to do that. Another thing to consider is their cultural background. This might have an effect on what you write and how you write it. For example, do they come from a culture that has a very matter-of-fact way of speaking, or do they come from a culture that perhaps does not have a very matter-of-fact way of speaking? Perhaps they kind of what we would call beat around the bush before they get to their point. Different cultures have different kind of rhetorical backgrounds. Now, so understand what culture they come from, and do a little bit of research, and that will help you determine, again, how you might write or organize the communication that you're creating for them. And then something very simple: what is their primary language? Is English, for example, their first language, or is it a second language? If it is a second or perhaps a third language, if it is not their original language, then you have to be careful about how you phrase things. You have to be careful about the words you use. Let me give you an example. The word hard in English often means the same as difficult, right? It's a synonym. So we can say it's really hard to open that door. That door is hard to open, okay? When what we are meaning is that door is difficult to open. The problem is the word hard also has another meaning. It could mean dense, as in a material, so a hard rock, or the concrete was hard. Okay, so what definition are you using if you are writing to somebody? It's difficult for them to understand perhaps what you mean by that. So choose your words carefully. Make sure that they translate easily into a different language, because they might be using a translator in order to read your communication with them. And just ensure that what you write is very clear and very concise, depending on their primary language. Next, consider the context and relationship with the reader, the document, and with yourself. Okay? So one thing to ask is, how much does the reader know about the communication? So for example, do they know that the communication is being sent to them or is being written? And how will that make a difference? Well, if they are expecting it from you, perhaps versus being surprised, that could make a difference in how they read it. Um, and is the reader's view of the communication positive or negative? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever received a negative communication? It could have been a text, it could have been an email, it could have been a letter, or perhaps even a phone call, but something that gave you bad news. Has that ever happened to you? If so, once you received the bad news, did you find it easy or difficult to then maintain focus on the rest of the communication? Oftentimes, for most people, we find it difficult. So in other words, you might read an email that says, perhaps a significant other is breaking up with you. I'm sorry, but I have to break up with you. Immediately we get either mad, or maybe we get angry, or we get perhaps sad. Maybe some of us feel relieved, but for the most part, our emotion takes over, and it's hard for us to read the rest of it, especially when we're mad. It's hard for us to understand what comes after that. So if the reader has a view of the document already, if they know that it's coming and they're afraid of it, or they're not looking forward to it, that might affect how it is they read the information. So it will also affect how you structure the information. Also, how much does the reader know about you? And does the reader have a positive or negative view towards you? If they know you and they respect you, or they know that they trust you, for example, well, that means that you can structure your information a certain way, and it means that you can include certain things in the information or in the communication that you might, or perhaps not include those things that you might otherwise include. For example, let's say the reader is a client or a customer of yours, or perhaps even your boss, and that person trusts you and knows that you're an expert about what it is you're writing about. So in a case like that, it wouldn't be as important to include, for example, sources for your information, because you wouldn't have to do that, because they already trust you. They think that they trust that you're getting your information from legitimate sources and that your answer is correct. However, let's say they don't know you. Let's say they have no relationship with you, or they've never heard of you. In a case like that, if you know this going into the communication, in a case like that, you will want to include references. You will want to show them where you got the information from, because that way it creates trust. It helps them understand that they can trust what it is you're saying, and they can ultimately trust you as well. And if they know about you, again, what if they have a negative attitude towards you? And what if you know this? Again, this is something that you'll have to overcome when you're writing the document. But it's important to know when you start writing the communication in the first place. This also goes with the organization, goes for the organization that you represent. So how much does the reader know about your organization? And does the reader have a positive or negative view towards your organization? So I worked for IBM for a while. IBM was a very trusted brand, and they are known for their innovation when it comes to technology. So therefore, if people knew who I worked for, they could usually trust what I had to say when it came to technology. Okay, so it created a little bit of trust, a little bit of credibility in me. However, if you worked for an organization that people have a negative view towards, let's say the IRS, well, you do have the power of law behind you, but it's hard to overcome people's negative feelings towards the IRS simply because people don't like it. My apologies if you work for the IRS or plan to work for the IRS. If you do, well, in any case, it's hard to overcome, but it is something that you will have to overcome. It's a challenge that you'll have to understand is there and that you will have to overcome. So that's the end of this slideshow. These are considerations for performing an audience analysis. I hope I answered some of your questions if you had any. If you do have any questions, feel free and leave comments down below. If you're in one of my classes and you have questions, feel free and send me an email. Again, this is Clint Lanier, PhD, Professor of Rhetoric and Professional Communication. Thank you.